Welcome to Knowledge Targeting Part 23 of 50. This episode is called Captive Populations, Experiments on Prisoners and Mental Patients. It is documented history, drawn from the government's own paper trail. Senate studies, prison policy statements, court records, and official inquiries. Over the next 2 hours, we follow a question that a Senate subcommittee put on the record in 1974 and never satisfactorily answered. Can a person who cannot leave the room truly volunteer for anything? That sentence was written by staff investigators for the United States Senate. Notice the quotation marks the subcommittee placed around one word: captive. They were describing who the federal government's new behavior modification programs were actually being tested on, and they settled on two groups: prisoners held by criminal sentence, and patients held in mental institutions under civil commitment orders. Those scare quotes were doing careful, deliberate work, and this episode is about what they carried. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series from TI One Voice. Each episode takes one chapter of the series book and works through it slowly, with the sources named as we go. We are now inside Section 3, which runs from Part 21 to Part 28 and examines the institutional framework, the agencies, the hospitals, the prisons, and the money. Section 3 opened 2 episodes ago. 27 further episodes still follow this one. Part 22 was called The Technology of Control, From Psychosurgery to Token Economies. It cataloged the instruments one after another. This episode asks the obvious next question: who were those instruments used on, and could those people have said no? Part 24, The Weaponization of Psychiatry, From the Seed to Psychosurgery, will follow the diagnosis itself as it becomes an instrument. Tools, then subjects, then the label that delivers one to the other. This series is made by TI One Voice, and the platform is at one.witisk.org. It holds 3 things worth your time: an evidence library, where incidents are documented in a consistent structure so that patterns can be tested rather than merely claimed; a knowledge base of sourced articles and archived primary documents, including the Senate study at the center of this episode; and a community wall moderated for comparing notes. There is also TITV, our 24-hour live stream, at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. It runs the series continuously, and no account is needed to watch. Every episode also has a written companion article, which matters here more than usual. This episode names documents, dates, and institutions rapidly. The article sets them out in writing so you can check the record for yourself rather than take our word for it. A word on method. Each episode begins with the chapter which fixes the subject. We then search the TI One Voice knowledge base, an indexed archive of declassified files, official reports, and scholarly histories, and pull passages that bear on it. Retrieved material supplements the chapter. It never sets the topic. Everything is then read back against the primary documents, and where the archive runs thin, the narration says so out loud. 3 registers run through this episode, and we keep them apart. First, the documented record, named studies, institutions, sponsors, dates, and the official inquiries that examine them. Second, context, what the consent rules actually were at the time, and exactly what later reform changed. Third, inference, any line drawn from this history toward present-day targeting claims. That third register is our argument, not the record's finding, and we flag it every time. A note for anyone watching because something is happening to them. This episode is history. Cannot tell you what is or is not happening in your life, and it does not try. It also carries an obligation. Nothing here is a reason to avoid a doctor or a mental health professional. The abuses we describe were failures of consent and oversight, not evidence that care itself should be refused. Here is the route. We begin with the word captive itself. Then projects start inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the facility at Butner, North Carolina. Then Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. Then the structural problem of consent behind bars. Then the intelligence money through MKULTRA. Then Willowbrook and Tuskegee, both of which broke open in 1972. Then a proposed violence center in California, and finally the institutionalized patient and the courts. Section 1. The word the Senate put in quotation marks. In 1974, staff investigators working under the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights of the Senate Judiciary Committee sat down to write a plain, unadorned description of who the federal government's behavior modification programs were being tested on. They were not writing polemic. They were writing a preface. And the word they reached for and then flagged with quotation marks was captive. The document is a Senate study titled Individual Rights and the Federal Role in Behavior Modification, published in 1974. It is not a hearing transcript. It was prepared by subcommittee staff, and its remit was constitutional, not medical, which shaped every question it asked. Its real weight sits at the back, in appendices reproducing program descriptions and prison policy statements in full. In our knowledge base, it is cataloged as KB2. The subcommittee named two groups. The first, prisoners confined by criminal sentence, their daily lives governed by correctional officers and institutional rules. The second, patients in mental institutions, held under civil commitment orders rather than convictions, their confinement justified not by what they had done but by a prediction, or by a diagnosis declaring them unable to care for themselves. Different doors, different paperwork. One shared condition underneath. Neither can walk out of the room. Consider what a refusal costs. A prisoner who declines to volunteer for a special treatment program may lose privileges. He may lose parole consideration because cooperation reads well on a file and refusal reads just as legibly. He may lose a transfer to a lower security facility. None of that has to be threatened aloud. Everyone inside the institution already knows the arithmetic, and the consent form does not mention it. On the civil side, the arithmetic is stranger still. A patient held on an involuntary commitment order has no release date to count down. Discharge depends on clinical judgment, and that judgment belongs to the same profession, sometimes the same ward, now asking them to take part in research. The subcommittee did not have to allege bad faith to see the problem. The structure produces the pressure all by itself, whoever is standing in the room. Hold on to that because it is the analytical center of everything that follows. The wrong in these programs is not primarily the strangeness of the procedures. It is the absence of meaningful consent and the exploitation of captivity to obtain a signature that looks like agreement. The question the subcommittee posed, and that this chapter traces across 8 sections, is whether the word voluntary means anything at all under those conditions. Nearly every factual claim ahead rests on one document, cataloged in our knowledge base as KB2. 3 parts of it matter most. The preface, where the subcommittee names its 2 captive populations. Appendix 2, which reproduces the Bureau of Prisons policy statement on research from 1967. And Appendix 3, which reproduces the actual program descriptions for Project START. Beyond that, we use journalism, scholarly histories, and litigation records. The 1974 study did not land in a quiet room. Tuskegee had been exposed in the press 2 years earlier and shut down that November. The hepatitis research at Willowbrook State School, running since 1956, had become a public scandal. Senator Edward Kennedy's subcommittee held hearings on biomedical research in 1973. By the time this study appeared, Congress was prepared to believe the worst about federally funded research on people who could not refuse. One number explains the mood in Washington. The syphilis study at Tuskegee ran for 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, under the United States Public Health Service. It was not the subject of the behavior modification report, and we will treat it properly later in the episode. What it established in advance was simpler and more damaging. A federal program could run for 4 decades without anyone effectively stopping it. Two things must stay separate as we go in. This record establishes precedent. Captive populations were used as research subjects by named institutions with federal money. It does not establish continuity with any program running now, and we will not pretend it does. And these were real people, many of them survived by family, so we describe what was done and what it violated without dwelling on it. Now, the word itself, captive. So we begin where the subcommittee began, with a single word, captive. It is not a term investigators reach for lightly in an official government study. It carries the weight of prisoner of war camps, of hostage situations, of human beings detained against their will. The Senate staff had softer words available. Institutionalized, confined, incarcerated, and they passed over every one of them. They chose the hardest word in the drawer, and they chose it on purpose. The word choice was itself an argument. It said that the ordinary rules of consent, the rules that govern medical research on free citizens, cannot simply be assumed to apply to people who are not free to leave the building. That argument has a founding document. In 1947, American judges sitting in judgment of Nazi physicians drafted the Nuremberg Code, and they opened it with one non-negotiable line about the human subject's consent. 10 words, and everything written since is an elaboration of them. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. The Belmont Report in 1979. The Federal Common Rule that governs American research today. Each builds on that one premise. And the premise rests on a condition that sounds obvious until you try to apply it literally. Voluntary consent requires a real option to say no, an option that carries no penalty. That chain of documents is worth holding in mind, because most of it arrives after the events in this chapter. Nuremberg came first in 1947. Helsinki followed in 1964. But Belmont, with its 3 principles of respect for persons, beneficence and justice, was not published until 1979. And the Common Rule was not codified across federal agencies until 1991. The protections we now take for granted were still being argued into existence. Be exact about what changed. The National Research Act of 1974 created the commission that would write Belmont, and it made Institutional Review Board's IRBS a condition of federal funding. For years later, a separate rule, Subpart C, imposed additional protections specifically on research involving prisoners, narrowing permitted studies to a short list of categories. Those are real reforms. They arrived after the events this chapter describes, and they remain contested at the edges. Consider how refusal works for a free citizen. A researcher explains the study, describes the risks, and asks. The citizen says no, walks out of the room, goes home, and continues a life entirely unaffected by that decision. Nobody writes the refusal into a file. Nobody weighs it later when deciding whether this person may go home, or keep a privilege, or be trusted. The choice is genuinely free because the chooser is genuinely free. For a sentenced prisoner, the arithmetic changes. Declining a special treatment program may be read by the very staff who control classification, privileges, and parole recommendations as a bad attitude, a refusal to engage with rehabilitation, a sign of someone not ready for release. The prisoner knows this or reasonably fears it. So the choice is no longer between 2 neutral options. It is between looking cooperative and paying an unknown price. For a patient held under civil commitment, the constraint is tighter still. Discharge depends on an evolving clinical judgment made by the same institution now asking for research participation. Cooperation can be read, consciously or not, as improving insight, as engagement with treatment, as readiness for a less restrictive setting. Refusal can be read as continued illness, as poor judgment. The line between clinical assessment and behavioral compliance blurs exactly where it should be sharpest. Both settings share one structural defect. The person being asked to volunteer is, at the same moment, in someone else's custody and dependent on that someone else for their eventual freedom. That is not a moral accusation against every researcher who worked in these places. Many acted in good faith under the rules of their time, believing they were advancing knowledge that would help future patients. It is a structural fact, and the subcommittee wanted it seen plainly. The knowledge base sharpens the point. Survey material on this era records that from the 1950s to the 1970s, subjects were, in its words, predominantly the powerless, the poor, and prisoners. That same material notes how often today's targeting literature cites these cases. Hold the distinction firmly. This history establishes precedent that such things were done and funded. It does not establish continuity, that they are being done now. That is the honest line. There is a name for what prisons and long-stay psychiatric institutions have in common, and a sociologist supplied it. Irving Goffman spent 1955 and 1956 doing fieldwork at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, a large federal psychiatric institution. The book that came out of it, published in 1961, was called Asylums. In it he described what he termed total institutions, and the phrase has never left the literature since. A total institution, in Goffman's definition, is a place where a large number of similarly situated people are cut off from wider society for an extended period and lead an enclosed, formally administered life. One roof controls nearly every dimension of a day. When you wake, what you eat, who you speak to, when the lights go out. The ordinary levers a free person pulls are not there. Quitting a job, moving house, walking out the door. Goffman gave the literature a vocabulary that later investigators kept borrowing. Mortification of self, for the stripping of ordinary identity on admission. And 4 ways inmates adapt. Withdrawal into oneself, intransigence, refusing to cooperate, colonization, treating the institution as home and maximizing its comforts, and conversion, adopting the staff's view of oneself as deviant or in need of correction. Notice that 2 of those 4 look, from the outside, exactly like consent. Behind the policy language sits brick and mortar. A corridor of cell doors, each lock worked from a station the prisoner cannot reach. A ward with a nursing desk at the entrance, a medication cart on a fixed schedule, a chart at the foot of the bed the patient is rarely allowed to read. Say this plainly, though, none of this history is a reason for anyone watching to avoid mental health care today. One caution about the argument just made. The subcommittee was not citing Goffman. His name does not appear anywhere in the 1974 study. The connection is an interpretation, made here, not a claim the Senate staff advanced. What the record does show is that they investigated prisons and mental institutions side by side, as 2 versions of one problem rather than 2 unrelated ones. That instinct tracks the same insight. So what is a consent form worth in that environment? It is not a lie. The signature is real, the ink is real, the form is filed. But research participation inside a total institution becomes entangled with an ecosystem of privileges. A better housing assignment, earlier release consideration, a favorable note in a chart the subject may never be allowed to read. The voluntariness Nuremberg requires can be absent while the paperwork looks perfect. Now set interpretation aside entirely and look at paperwork. Bare facts first before any reading of them. Project START, the acronym stands for Special Treatment and Rehabilitative Training, operated inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the early 1970s. The 1974 Senate study reproduces the program's own documentation in its appendices. And what the appendices contain is not 1 document but 3. The same program description, written and then rewritten twice. The dates are these. A program description first written in October 1972. A revision in May 1973. A second revision in November 1973. 3 separate versions of the same federal document, produced across roughly 13 months, each one a small window onto how the program's own architects were rethinking or defending its design while scrutiny built around them. The Senate study preserved all three, not merely the last one. 3 revisions in just over a year is not the normal cadence of federal program documentation. Descriptions are usually rewritten when a funding cycle changes, when enabling legislation is updated, or when a new administration arrives. 13 months suggests something else, a program actively being reconsidered, whether by internal bureau review, outside legal pressure, the wider civil liberties scrutiny then falling on prison behavior modification work, or some combination of all three. We cannot say which. And here the evidence runs out. We do not have a line-by-line comparison of what each revision altered. The subcommittee's appendices reproduce the documents. They do not annotate the differences. What survives is the cadence itself, proof that whatever START was in October 1972, its own authors already felt it needed rewriting. Next, we follow that program to a facility the Bureau built with research designed into its founding purpose. So the story does not end at the door of a single unit. What the Bureau of Prisons did next says more than Project START ever could on its own. It did not simply run behavior modification inside an ordinary penitentiary and hope the arrangement held. It planned a facility. It named a location. And it wrote that location into the same federal documents the Senate subcommittee would later preserve for the record. The Federal Correctional Complex at Butner, North Carolina, is named explicitly in the Bureau's own program materials, and those materials were reproduced inside the 1974 Senate study. Butner was conceived as a place where work of the kind Project START represented could be developed, tested, and refined under something closer to laboratory conditions than an ordinary cell block allows. That phrase deserves a moment. Laboratory conditions inside a federal prison. A cell block is built to hold people. A research facility is built to observe them, to vary the conditions they live under, and to record what follows. The difference is not rhetoric. It is poured into the floor plan. When a government designs a building around behavioral programming, it has already decided that the programming will continue, that it will be funded, and that it will need somewhere permanent to happen. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what the Bureau thought it was doing. A program run informally in whatever prison happens to hold a difficult inmate can be disclaimed later as a local arrangement that got out of hand. Purpose-built center cannot. Someone requested the money. Someone approved the plans. Someone signed the drawings. An institutional commitment leaves signatures behind it, and signatures are the one thing an inquiry can follow. Put plainly, the Bureau of Prisons was not treating behavior modification as an experimental sideline in the early 1970s. It was treating it as a durable, funded, architecturally embedded part of how the federal system planned to manage the inmates. Its own documents called management problems. That is the phrase in the record. Not the dangerous, not the violent. Management problems, a category defined by the difficulty a person poses to administration. Butner opened in 1976. It housed a research unit that became a subject of controversy in its own right, where behavioral research on incarcerated people continued under federal auspices, with consent procedures that outside critics went on questioning long after the 1974 funding reckoning we will come to shortly. The story, in other words, did not stop when one program was defunded. By then, the building was already going up. The knowledge base entry on the behaviorist B.F. Skinner records the same pair of facilities. In the 1970s, it notes the Federal Bureau of Prisons experimented with behavior modification programs at the Marion Penitentiary and at the Federal Correctional Institution at Butner, North Carolina, using token economies, level systems, and other operant techniques to manage inmate behavior. The same 2 places, named in the government's paper trail and again in the knowledge base. Here is where care is owed. This history establishes precedent. It does not establish continuity. Nothing in the Senate study shows that prisons, hospitals, or medical research today are running covert programs. That would be a separate claim, needing separate evidence. What the record does show is that a government once decided captivity made people convenient to study, and built accordingly. Hold those two statements apart. The argument only survives if you do. Why insist on Butner at all? Because it is the difference between anecdote and institution. An anecdote has a rumor, a claim, a witness whose memory can be doubted. This has a name, a place on a map, a stated research mission and appropriation, and a set of federal documents a Senate subcommittee gathered and printed. You do not have to trust anyone's recollection. You can read the government describing its own intentions. None of this happened in a policy vacuum. The Bureau of Prisons had issued a formal policy statement governing research on prisoners as early as October 31, 1967, 5 years before Project START's first program description was written, and 7 years before the subcommittee assembled its final report. The statement is reproduced in Appendix 2 of the 1974 study. It repays reading for what it reveals about how the Bureau understood its own obligations. Lay the dates side by side and a shape appears. 1967, the research policy. 1972, the first written description of Project START. 1973, that description revised under evident pressure. 1974, the subcommittee's report. 1976, Butner opens. 7 years separate the rule from the reckoning, and in those 7 years the rule did not prevent what the reckoning was called to examine. That gap is the subject of everything that follows. So what did the 1967 statement actually do? 3 things on its own terms. It acknowledged that research on prisoners raised special ethical concerns. It required that proposed research be reviewed, at least on paper, before approval. And it gestured toward the need for consent. 3 sound commitments written down 7 years before the hearings. The question the subcommittee had to answer was whether any of them had any force in practice. It also supplied the administrative machinery a proposal like Project START's was meant to satisfy: the forms to be filed, the approvals to be obtained, the documentation to be maintained. That chain looks reassuring on an organizational chart. But the Bureau proposed, the Bureau reviewed, the Bureau approved, and the Bureau kept the file. Whether that sequence protected anyone in practice is exactly the question the subcommittee was convened to ask. And there is the hole at the center of it. The statement gestured toward consent without specifying what consent would have to mean for a population that cannot simply refuse without consequence. That is not a quibble. Consent is the whole of the matter. In a place where cooperation can shape privileges, classification, and how a person is judged by those who decide his future, agreement offered under those conditions is not obviously agreement at all. The knowledge base makes the same point about a separate proposal from the same era, the Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence, which planned to use prisoners and mental hospital patients as subjects. Critics said those populations could not give meaningful informed consent because of the coercive environment of incarceration and institutionalization. Different program, identical objection. The problem was never one warden or one unit. It was captivity itself. The existence of a policy framework is not the same as the adequacy of that framework. That sentence carries the section. The subcommittee's investigation was precisely an inquiry into whether the paperwork was doing the protective work the Bureau's own policy claimed it would. A rule that exists and a rule that binds are different objects. Only one of them shows up in the life of the person it is meant to protect. Be exact about what changed afterwards. The National Research Act of 1974 created a national commission, which reported on research involving prisoners in 1976. In 1978, federal regulations added a subpart devoted to prisoners, narrowing sharply the research that federal funds could support. The Belmont Report followed in 1979, and the Common Rule in 1991. Real reform, and every piece of it arriving after the fact. Which brings us to the name itself. Special treatment and rehabilitative training. Treatment. rehabilitation, training. Every word borrowed from care rather than control. That is not necessarily deceptive. Program names across many federal agencies in that era favored clinical, optimistic language. But it is worth pausing on the gap between a program's title and a subject's lived experience of it, because that gap is where accountability tends to get lost. A name like this tells a legislator or a budget office what the Bureau wanted the program understood to accomplish. It does not tell you what actually happened inside the unit, what the training consisted of day to day, which privileges depended on cooperation, how a prisoner was routed into the program, and how, if at all, that placement could be contested. On those questions, the record thins, and this series will not pretend otherwise. So here is what can be said with confidence, and no more. A federally documented behavior modification program, aimed at prisoners the Bureau classified as management problems, existed. It was named. It was funded. It was revised under evident pressure. All of that is public record. What the record does not settle is how it ended, and who ended it. That is the 1974 funding reckoning, and it is where we go next. Project START left a federal paper trail. The next case left a bigger one, and it was not federal at all. In 1951, a dermatologist from the University of Pennsylvania named Albert Kligman began testing at Holmesburg Prison, a city jail in northeast Philadelphia. He was not smuggled in. He was invited, approved, and paid. What followed became one of the most thoroughly documented examples of research on a captive population in American history. How large was it? Over roughly 2 decades, Kligman and his colleagues ran an estimated several thousand experiments on hundreds of Holmesburg prisoners. That estimate is not ours. It comes from the historian Alan Hornblum, whose 1998 book Acres of Skin reconstructed the program from prison records, university files, and interviews with the men themselves. The number is approximate because the record is incomplete. The order of magnitude is not in dispute. The work ran along a spectrum. At one end, ordinary consumer testing, how a soap or a lotion behaved on skin, how quickly a cream was absorbed. At the other end, deliberate injury as a method, high doses of ultraviolet light to study sunburn, concentrated irritants to study inflammation, and experimental drugs whose safety profiles had not yet been established. The point is not the shock of the procedures. The point is who was available to receive them. Kligman was asked about Holmesburg decades later, and he was not apologetic. Of the prison yard, he said, quote, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." In another interview, he called it an anthropoid colony, the best substitute for mankind. Those words gave Hornblum his title. They also give the whole problem in a sentence. The men were not people who happened to be subjects. They were subjects who happened to be people. The men were paid, typically a few dollars an experiment, more for procedures that hurt or ran long. And for a man with no other income, a few dollars was real money. Toothpaste stamps, a phone call home. Defenders of the program have always pointed to that payment as proof of choice. But consider what the payment was competing against. If the alternative to volunteering is having nothing at all, the offer is not competing with anything. That is the structural question the Senate subcommittee had already identified. Payment is not coercion. Paying research volunteers is normal and it is ethical. What changes inside a prison is the surrounding field. A free volunteer weighs a fee against other ways of earning. A prisoner has no other ways. Economists would say his opportunity cost is zero, and that is exactly what made him cheap, and exactly what makes his consent hard to trust. Here is the arc with dates. Testing began in 1951. From the mid-60s, some of it was funded by the United States Army, which paid to test incapacitating chemical agents. Prison testing ended in 1974. Hornblum's history appeared in 1998. A lawsuit brought by former inmates was dismissed in 2002 as filed too late. The University of Pennsylvania apologized in 2021. The city of Philadelphia followed a year later. Note what the apologies did and did not do. An apology is an acknowledgement of the record. It is not compensation, and it is not a finding of liability. When about 300 former Holmesburg men sued, the case turned on the statute of limitations, not on what happened to them, and it was dismissed. That is a recurring feature here. The wrong becomes officially admitted long after the law has closed the door on repairing it. So far, this is a story about one dermatologist and one jail. It is bigger than that. Holmesburg was not a private hobby. It was a business relationship, and the customers were some of the largest companies in America. To understand why a prison became attractive to industry, you have to stop thinking about medicine for a moment and think about procurement, about cost, reliability, and the absence of anyone with the authority to say no. By the 1960s, Kligman had working relationships with more than 30 pharmaceutical and chemical companies. The names in the record include Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, and several major cosmetics manufacturers. They paid the University of Pennsylvania for access to the Holmesburg population. Read that arrangement plainly. A city jail had become a contract research facility, and the men held inside it were the facility's principal asset, supplied by the state and billed for by a university. The economics were not subtle. Free volunteers cost more because they have wages to give up. Free volunteers miss appointments, move house, and drop out halfway through a protocol. Men in a prison do none of those things. They are there in the morning, there in the evening, and there again in 6 weeks for the follow-up reading. Every property that makes a research population convenient was, in this case, produced by incarceration itself. Here is what did not exist around that arrangement. No federal law prohibited it. No state law required independent review. No regulatory body held jurisdiction. The doctrine of informed consent was emerging in the medical literature, but it had almost no institutional machinery behind it. In a phrase later applied to several captive research populations, the prisoners were a virtually unlimited supply of human subjects. Supply is a word from commerce, and it is the correct word here. Holmesburg surfaced slowly through investigative journalism in the 1970s, then in full with Hornblum's book. It is now a fixed landmark in bioethics teaching. The TI One Voice knowledge base summarizes it this way. The experiments highlight the importance of informed consent, the need for independent oversight, and the dangers of conflating medical research with national security interests. It was one of several scandals surfacing in those same few years, and together they changed the question. One caution, and we will repeat it. Holmesburg is absent from the Senate study because the subcommittee was examining federal behavior modification programs, not university drug testing. But it shaped the air its investigators breathed. And here is the inference labeled as inference. This history establishes that captive people have been used as research material with official permission. It does not establish that anything comparable is running today. That is a separate claim, needing separate evidence. Now go back to where all of this is supposed to be governed from. Modern research ethics traces its founding sentence to 1947 and to a courtroom in Nuremberg. American judges Walter Beals, Harold Sebring, and Johnson Crawford had spent weeks hearing evidence about experiments performed on concentration camp prisoners. The defendants, most of them physicians, argued that they had been advancing medical knowledge and that the suffering served science. The judges rejected that defense completely. Into their verdict, the judges wrote 10 principles that became the Nuremberg Code. The first one carries all the weight. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The principle then spells out what that requires. Legal capacity to consent. Free power of choice, without force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or any other form of constraint. and enough knowledge and comprehension to make an understanding and enlightened decision. 3 conditions, all of them required together. Now apply that literally to a prison and watch each condition strain. A prisoner's day is structured by force and constraint. That is what incarceration means. A prisoner's choices are shaped by duress, worse conditions, lost privileges, a delayed release. And a prisoner's knowledge of the study is bounded by the same information gap that governs everything else inside, because the people explaining the research are the people who control his life. There is an uncomfortable footnote to Nuremberg that the knowledge base preserves. Defense counsel at the doctor's trial pointed to American practice, including malaria research conducted on inmates at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois during the war. The tribunal rejected the comparison. But Andrew Ivy, the American physician advising the prosecution, went on to chair the state committee that declared that Illinois program ethical. The standard was written by people who had not yet applied it at home. So what actually changed? In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act. In 1978, a dedicated federal rule, Subpart C, narrowed prisoner research to a handful of permitted categories and required extra review. The Belmont Report followed in 1979 with 3 principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Those rules are real and they bind. They are also still argued over, most visibly when a panel proposed loosening them in 2006. None of this means every prison study of that era was invalid. Some subjects in some programs almost certainly gave consent as free as the setting allowed. What it means is that the setting demands a higher standard of scrutiny because the ordinary safeguard, the ability to walk out, was removed by the state. The burden sits with the researcher and the institution, which raises the obvious question: what did the paperwork actually say? It would be a mistake to picture these programs as operating with no paperwork at all. Federal research of this era usually produced a form, a general description of the study, and the participant's signature at the bottom. The signature was real. The form was filed. On its own administrative terms, the record was complete. But a signature answers a much narrower question than the one research ethics actually asks. That gap is the whole story. Nuremberg's standard is about voluntariness, the presence of a genuine, penalty-free alternative, not about documentation. A form can be signed by someone who felt, correctly or not, that refusing would cost them something real. The form will never record that pressure. On paper, that signature looks exactly like the signature of a free volunteer who weighed risks and benefits with nothing hanging over their head. The record is complete and, on the only question that matters, silent. So the form records agreement. It does not record the conditions under which the agreement was given, and those conditions are exactly what the Nuremberg Standard concerns itself with. A prisoner signing in 1972 was signing inside a building whose staff controlled his mail, his work assignment, his housing, and his parole file. None of that appears on the page. The paperwork is not evidence of voluntariness. It is evidence of paperwork. Read that sentence again with a prison in mind. Voluntary. Not documented, not witnessed, not countersigned. Voluntary. The judges at Nuremberg went further in the same paragraph. The subject must be free of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or any other form of constraint. Duress is the word that does the work here, because incarceration is a condition of continuous, lawful duress. That is what a sentence is. It is not an accusation. It is a definition. Set the 2 columns side by side and the mismatch is obvious. On the left, everything an institution can produce from its own filing cabinet. On the right, everything the ethical standard actually requires, none of which a filing cabinet can demonstrate. This is not a technicality. It is the reason that, half a century later, we no longer treat a signature as the end of the consent question. We treat it as the beginning. This is what the Senate subcommittee was probing as it worked through Bureau of Prisons policy and program files. Not whether paperwork existed, it plainly did, but whether the structure around the paperwork existed. Independent ethics review, a genuinely uncoerced choice, and oversight from someone outside the institution running the program. 3 questions, all of them structural. And in 1974, for most prison and institutional research, the honest answers were thin and uneven. That was the finding. The modern system of institutional review boards, federally mandated committees of researchers, ethicists, and community members empowered to approve, modify, or reject proposed human subjects research, was only just being born. It did not exist when Project START wrote its first program description in 1972. When we imagine an ethics committee reviewing that document, we are imagining a body that had not yet been invented. There was no such committee to send it to. The National Research Act was signed into law on July 12, 1974. That date sits inside a very tight cluster. It came 5 months after the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration canceled the funding this chapter documents in its final section, and in the same year the Senate subcommittee published its findings. The law created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, and it made ethics review a federal requirement rather than a local courtesy. Lay the dates out and the sequence explains itself. 1947 sets the standard. The programs run for a quarter of a century without the machinery to enforce it. 1974 builds the machinery. Then, in 1978, federal regulations add specific extra protections for prisoners as research subjects. And in 1979, the Belmont Report names the 3 principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, that still govern the field. The order matters. Be exact about what reformed. Ethics review became mandatory and independent. Prisoners gained a separate regulatory category with tighter limits on what research they may join. The common rule, adopted across federal agencies in 1991, extended the framework further. What remains contested is narrower and real: how well review boards handle coercion they cannot see, and whether the rules bind classified work at all. Here the record is genuinely unsettled, and honest people disagree. Return now to the programs themselves. Project START was a federal prison program with a public paper trail. Holmesburg was a university testing operation conducted in the open, however ethically deficient. Both could be investigated because both left records an investigator could subpoena and read. The program we turned to next was different in kind. It was built to leave as little trace as possible, and most of what it did leave was destroyed. The program's name is MKULTRA. It was the Central Intelligence Agency's research effort into the control of human behavior, running under various code names from 1953 through at least the late 1960s. Naming it and naming the officials who directed it is a statement about documented acts in public office. It is not a characterization of private individuals, and this chapter keeps that line firmly. The distinction runs through the whole series. It was classified, conducted substantially outside the ordinary mechanisms of congressional oversight and public accountability. Its full scope may never be known because its then director, Richard Helms, ordered most of its files destroyed in January 1973, just as the Watergate scandal was beginning to expose the darker corners of the American intelligence establishment. That destruction order is itself part of the documented record. It was later examined by the Church Committee. So what is known comes from 4 kinds of source. Roughly 20,000 pages of financial records that survived the destruction order because they had been filed in a different office and were overlooked. Testimony from agency officials questioned by the Church Committee in 1975 and by Senator Ted Kennedy's Health Subcommittee in 1977. The recollections of some participating researchers. And the fragmentary accounts of a few subjects, for partial windows and no complete one. 20,000 pages sounds like a great deal until you consider what it is. An accounting trail. Invoices, grant transfers, subproject numbers. It tells you that money moved and roughly where it went. It very rarely tells you what was done to whom. That is the shape of this evidence, and it is worth saying plainly the surviving record is strongest on budgets and weakest on people. Here, in a real sense, the evidence runs out. The program was initiated on April 13, 1953, on the orders of the agency's director Allen Dulles, in response to reports, some credible, some exaggerated, that the Soviet Union was developing techniques for brainwashing American prisoners of war. The initial scope was broad: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychoactive drugs, and LSD above all, electroconvulsive treatment delivered in interrogation settings, and other methods for extracting information from resistant subjects. The fear supplied the budget. The program's money moved through cutouts, fake foundations, front companies, and university administrators who did not know what they were passing along. The most prominent was the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later renamed the Human Ecology Fund, which distributed agency money to researchers at more than 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, and prisons. The researchers believed they held grants from a private foundation interested in behavioral science. They did not. The concealment was the design. The surviving financial records number the work as subprojects, and the variety is startling. Subproject 1, Alcohol and Drug Effects on Behavior. Subproject 3, LSD given to people who had not been told. Subproject 8, Defensive Research into Resisting Chemical Interrogation, which by its nature required testing the interrogation first. Subproject 47, Hypnosis, Amnesia, and Implanted Memory. The numbering is bureaucratic. Behind each number sit people who were never asked. One subproject shows how far unwitting testing went. Subproject 54, known as Operation Midnight Climax, established agency-run premises in San Francisco and New York where visitors were dosed with LSD without their knowledge while officers observed through two-way mirrors. Set beside the funding chain, the logic is the same at every scale. At each step, one party knows less and the person at the end knows nothing at all. Consent cannot survive that structure. Subproject 35 funded the administration of psychoactive drugs to prisoners at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, one of several documented points where this program reached a captive population inside an American institution. How many people were exposed in total will never be known. The 1973 destruction made certainty impossible. The surviving documents and official testimony support at least dozens, and plausibly hundreds. Beyond that we cannot say. One case, though, is documented in full. Most of the people dosed under MKUltra are names we will never have. The files were destroyed in 1973, and with them the only record that could have identified them. One case is the exception. It is documented in detail because a family refused to accept the official account, and because a Senate committee 22 years later made the truth harder to withhold. His name was Frank Olson, and he was not a prisoner. Olson was a civilian biochemist with the United States Army's Chemical Corps, based at Fort Detrick in Maryland. He was a scientist inside the system, cleared, trusted, and working on the government's own biological research. That matters for what follows. The program did not reserve its unwitting subjects for people at the margins. It also used its own colleagues at a working retreat who had no idea they were the experiment. The dates are narrow. On the evening of November 19, 1953, at a retreat beside Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland, Olson's drink was spiked with LSD by a CIA officer. He was not told before or during. Later estimates put the dose near 70 micrograms, strong, but not extreme. What followed was 9 days of acute distress, and then, in Manhattan, a death that the agency described for 22 years as a suicide. Deep Creek Lake was, on paper, a professional gathering scientists from Fort Detrick and the agency, sharing a lodge for a few days of talk. It was also, unannounced to most of the men present, a test site. The dosing was an experiment on colleagues, conducted by a colleague. The officer who administered it, Robert Lashbrook, was acting within a program that treated surprise itself as an experimental variable. Nobody at that table had agreed to anything. It is worth being precise about what was violated, because the shock of the story can crowd out the analysis. The Nuremberg Code, written in 1947, requires that a subject knows what is being given, can refuse without penalty, and can stop. None of those three was available to Olson. He could not refuse a drink he did not know was dosed. The wrong here is the absence of consent, not the strangeness of the drug. In the days that followed, colleagues described Olson as agitated and withdrawn, convinced that something had gone badly wrong. He was taken to New York to see a physician, Harold Abramson, a doctor with his own connection to the agency's research, who prescribed sedatives and, by the family's later account, suggested a psychiatric admission. Note the shape of that. The people managing the aftermath were the same institution that had caused it. In the early hours of November 28th, Olson went through the window of a 10th-floor hotel room in Manhattan and died in the street below. He was 43 with a wife and 3 children. We are not going to dwell on that morning. What matters for this chapter is what happened next. The account his family was given, who wrote it, and how long it was allowed to stand. That is where the record turns. The CIA told Olson's family he had jumped. A suicide, a private tragedy, nothing to do with anyone's work. That account was not corrected in 1954, or 1960, or 1970. It held for 22 years. It held not because it was convincing but because the information needed to test it was classified, and the people who held that information were the people it protected. That is a design feature, not an accident. What broke it was not new evidence about that hotel room. It was the Church Committee and the wider opening of the intelligence agency's files in 1975. Once MKUltra was public, the Olson story could no longer be held in place. The agency acknowledged that he had been dosed without his knowledge, that the drug had likely contributed to his deterioration, and that its original explanation to the family had been incomplete. President Gerald Ford met the family at the White House and apologized on behalf of the United States. Congress then passed a private bill, legislation written for one family, providing compensation. Both of those are real acknowledgments, and they are more than almost any other MKUltra subject received. They are also the exception that shows the rule. The remedy required a dead scientist, a national scandal, and an act of Congress. The knowledge base entry on the Olson death puts the significance plainly, and it is worth holding that sentence still for a moment. Every word in it is documented. No inference is being smuggled in. This is not a claim about what might have happened to someone. It is the government's own admission about what did happen to a named employee, in a named month, with a death certificate at the end of it. In 1994, the family had Olson's body exhumed, and a second forensic examination found an injury to the left side of the skull that some experts read as hard to explain by a fall alone. That has been taken to suggest he did not go through the window unaided. It is contested. No prosecution followed, no court ruled, and 40 years underground complicates any reading. Here the evidence genuinely runs out. Now a correction, because this is where careless argument does real damage. MKUltra was not a prison research program in the way Project START and Holmesburg were. The agency did not run a behavioral unit inside a federal penitentiary, and most of its subjects were not incarcerated. Merging the two makes a stronger-sounding story and a weaker true one. The intersection is real, but it is narrower than the rhetoric usually allows, and it needs stating precisely. The first intersection is a place. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, was a federal facility studying addiction using subjects drawn largely from the prison population. It received MKUltra money, Subproject 35 in the surviving financial records, for work that gave psychoactive drugs to prisoners, in at least some cases without fully informed consent. From inside that building, The difference between studying addiction and studying behavior control was invisible. The second intersection is a precedent, and precedent has to be handled carefully. What the record establishes is that a national security agency ran behavior control research on people who had not agreed to it, and kept it running for nearly 2 decades. That proves the pattern is possible and that it has occurred. It does not prove that any later program repeated it. This chapter's argument is about precedent. It is not a finding of continuity. For the Senate subcommittee sitting in 1974, this was the backdrop. The knowledge base entry on the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights records that it examined behavior modification on captive populations, specifically prisoners and mental patients, and framed the issues as informed consent and involuntary treatment. MKUltra was surfacing in the same years. Every agency assurance that its own oversight was adequate had to be weighed against a program that had just been caught. Which brings us to Staten Island. Willowbrook State School opened in 1947 as a New York State facility for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It was built for roughly 4,000 residents. By the middle of the 1960s, it held more than 6,000 children and adults, some profoundly disabled, in conditions a later federal investigation would describe, in a single word, as inhumane. That word is the investigation's, not ours. 2,000 people over capacity is not a statistic about a building. It is a staffing ratio of roughly 1 attendant to every 40 or 50 residents, which means nobody is being cared for, only contained. It means untreated medical conditions, malnourishment, and sanitary conditions that failed by any standard anyone would accept. We will describe what that produced. We will not linger on it for effect. The record does the work here. The children at Willowbrook were captive in the fullest sense the phrase carries. They arrived by 3 routes: parents who could not manage at home, agencies with no other placement, and court orders committing them to the state's custody. Once there, they could not leave. They could not advocate for themselves. Many could not understand what was being done to them, or form the question that would let them object. And here is the structural point that carries into the next stretch. The doctors and administrators who controlled whether these children stayed confined were also the people who decided whether they would become research subjects. One set of hands on both doors. In the early 1960s, a pediatric researcher from New York University began a hepatitis study in those wards, and that is where we go next. The ethics of it are still being argued. The doctor who made that decision was Saul Krugman, a pediatrician and infectious disease researcher at the New York University School of Medicine. He came to Willowbrook in the mid-1950s for a reason that was, on its face, sound. Hepatitis was endemic there. It moved through those crowded wards the way a cold moves through a nursery. If you wanted to study the disease, this was where the disease already lived. Krugman's scientific goal was respectable, and it is worth saying so plainly. He wanted to map the natural history of hepatitis infection in children. He wanted to separate the types because hepatitis A and hepatitis B could not then be reliably told apart. And he wanted to move toward a vaccine. Every one of those aims was legitimate. The question this chapter puts is not about the aim. It is about the method. The method was to expose newly admitted children to the virus on purpose. Some were as young as 3. They were fed an extract prepared from the stools of infected patients, designed to carry the hepatitis virus. The knowledge base records a second route as well: injection of blood products drawn from infected donors. The children were housed in a separate unit that the staff themselves referred to as the hepatitis ward. Understanding the consent question means understanding the 2 wards. The general wards were overcrowded and desperately understaffed. Krugman's research unit had its own space, better staffing, cleaner conditions, more individual attention. Parents who agreed to enroll their child were told, accurately, that the child would receive better care than the institution could otherwise provide. They were also told, perhaps less clearly, that the child would be deliberately infected with a potentially dangerous virus. How long did this run? The knowledge base dates the Willowbrook hepatitis program from 1956 to 1970. 14 years of work, published in the medical journals of the day, presented at conferences, reviewed by the bodies that funded it. This was not a covert operation. There was no cover story and no shredded file. It ran in the open, in print, under Krugman's own name, and the profession largely approved. Objections existed, and they were published at the time. In 1966, the Harvard anesthetist Henry Beecher set out 22 examples of unethical research in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Willowbrook work is generally identified among them. The following year, the British physician Maurice Papworth made a similar case in his book Human Guinea Pigs. The standard that condemned this research was not invented afterwards. It already existed, in print. Krugman defended the studies for the rest of his career. His argument had three parts. The children would have caught hepatitis anyway in those wards. The research unit gave them better care, and the knowledge served every child who came after. His work did contribute to the eventual hepatitis B vaccine, and in 1983 the profession gave him a Lasker Award. The bioethics community that formed in the 1970s rejected the argument entirely. Set the dates side by side and the shape of the reckoning appears. The work begins in 1956. Beecher publishes in 1966. In 1971, letters in the Lancet argue that no valid consent could have been obtained at Willowbrook. In 1972, television reporting carries the conditions into American living rooms. 2 years later, Congress acts. Exposure came from journalists, families, and advocates, not from the profession policing itself. Which brings us to the piece of paper. The Willowbrook consent form has been picked over in the bioethics literature for half a century, because of what it reveals about the limits of paperwork. It described the research in general terms. It stated that the children would be exposed to hepatitis. It noted that the research unit offered better conditions than the general wards. As such documents went, it was relatively frank. It was more detailed than many consent forms of its era, and considerably more honest than what accompanied the Holmesburg dermatology testing, or the dosing carried out under MKUltra, where subjects were often told nothing whatsoever. So the failure here is not fraud. Nobody forged the document. The parents were not lied to about the central fact. And the consent still could not do the work that consent is supposed to do. Here is why. Voluntary consent means a genuine choice between two acceptable options. That is not what parents at Willowbrook were offered. They were choosing between a research ward with decent care and a general ward whose conditions, by any reasonable standard, amounted to neglect. The option that would have made the choice free, a properly staffed institution that did not charge research participation as the price of decent care, did not exist. Notice where the responsibility sits. The state of New York maintained an institution in which decent care was available mainly to research subjects. Having made the baseline that bad, the state turned a serious risk into something that resembled a gift. The researchers did not have to coerce anybody. The conditions did the coercing, quietly, in advance, long before any parent was ever handed a pen and asked to sign. And Willowbrook was not singular. In 2011, the Associated Press reporter Mike Staub cataloged a long American record of experiments on inmates and disabled people. The knowledge base lists several. Hepatitis given to psychiatric patients in Connecticut. Pandemic influenza sprayed into the noses of prisoners at the Maryland House of Correction. Live cancer cells injected into chronically ill patients at a Brooklyn hospital in 1963. Different diseases, the same population. When the Senate examined prison research in the 1970s, its finding matched what the Willowbrook form exposes. The knowledge-based summary of the Kennedy subcommittee hearings puts it in a single line. Confinement itself defeated consent. That is a structural claim, not an accusation against any individual doctor. Move the identical protocol outside the institution and the paperwork starts working. Keep it inside and the paperwork is theater performed for the record. Hold that finding because the longest-running case in this history was already 40 years old by the time Congress acted. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute in Macon County, Alabama, began a study under a title it never hid. The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. 600 black men enrolled. 399 had syphilis. 201 were controls. Most were poor, many were sharecroppers, some could not read. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local phrase that covered a range of ailments. They were offered free medical examinations, free meals, and burial insurance. They were not told that they had syphilis. They were not told what the study was actually for. And they were not told that the men running it never intended to treat them. Penicillin changed everything in the mid-1940s. A disease that had been chronic and life-threatening became reliably curable with a course of injections. The men in the study were not offered it. Some were actively prevented from obtaining it when they sought care elsewhere. Treatment existed, worked, and was withheld for 25 years. Not through oversight or confusion, but as a decision, renewed year after year by people who knew. A fair objection arises here. These men were not locked up. They were not prisoners, and they were not patients held in custody, so why do they belong in a chapter about captive populations? Because captivity is broader than a locked door. Poverty, segregation, illiteracy, and the absence of any other doctor for miles produce the same condition. Subjects who cannot walk away, cannot check the story, and cannot refuse. By July 1972, when the Associated Press reporter Jean Heller broke the story, the accounting stood like this. 128 of the men had died of syphilis or its complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. Those are the figures the record supports. The harm that cannot be counted, to families and to trust in medicine, is real and unquantified. Hold one distinction as we go on. Everything in this chapter is documented history. Named studies, named sponsors, published papers, official inquiries. What it establishes for present-day targeting claims is precedent, not continuity. It shows these things were done, for decades, in the open by institutions that believe themselves ethical. Whether anything comparable is running today is a separate question needing separate evidence. What happened when Tuskegee broke comes next. The record did not surface on its own. A public health service venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton had been hired in the mid-1960s, learned what was happening in Macon County, and spent years pressing his own agency about it. He wrote memoranda. He filed complaints. He argued the ethics internally, through every channel the department offered him, and the department declined to stop the study. Only when the internal route closed did he go outside it. He took it to the press. On the 25th of July, 1972, the Associated Press published Jean Heller's story, and 40 years of federal record-keeping became a national scandal inside a single news cycle. Heller had the documents, the enrollment numbers, and the plain fact that penicillin had been withheld. The study had never been secret in the medical literature. It had simply never been read by anyone with the standing and the will to stop it. The reaction was immediate. Within weeks, a 40-year experiment on black men who had been deceived, denied treatment, and allowed to die became the single most powerful symbol of medical racism in American history. It did not become that because the facts were new. It became that because the facts were finally in front of the public in ordinary language, attached to names and numbers, in a country already arguing hard about civil rights. The institutional response followed fast. The NAACP demanded an investigation. Senator Abraham Ribikoff opened hearings. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare convened an ad hoc advisory panel. which reported that the study was, in its own phrase, ethically unjustified, and recommended that it end. The study was halted. The surviving men were finally offered treatment, and the political ground was cleared for the legislation that would arrive 2 years later. 2 words carried the finding. The panel did not say the study had been poorly designed, or badly supervised, or mishandled at the end. It said the study should never have run at all. That judgment mattered because it came from inside the same department that had funded the work for 4 decades, and because it left no room for the defense that had sustained the study throughout, that the men were merely being observed. Now set the calendar out side by side. Tuskegee broke in the summer of 1972. That same year, the first program description for Project START was circulating inside the Bureau of Prisons. Less than 2 years after that, the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights published its study of behavior modification in federal institutions. 3 separate threads, 3 different agencies, 3 different populations, all running through the same short stretch of American time. The connection between them is not causal, and it is worth being precise about that. Tuskegee was a different abuse by a different agency, begun in a different decade with a different aim, to watch a disease run its course. The behavior modification programs aimed at something else entirely, at changing conduct. What links them is not a shared program. What links them is a shared assumption about who may be used, and a shared silence about consent. The link is contextual and the context did real work. By the time the subcommittee's catalog appeared, the American public and the American Congress had already absorbed Tuskegee. They no longer needed persuading that poor, uneducated, institutionalized people could be enrolled in research without knowing it, because they had just watched exactly that happen for 40 years. A report that might have been dismissed as alarmist in 1965 was read, in 1974, as credible. That readiness to believe was not misplaced, because the pattern ran well beyond the 2 cases everyone now remembers. The Willowbrook hepatitis studies were not an isolated episode. Through the middle of the 20th century, children held in orphanages, in state schools for the disabled, and in residential facilities for the mentally ill were used as test subjects for experimental vaccines. The practice was rarely discussed in public. It was widely known inside medical research. The knowledge base's account of this era puts the appeal bluntly. Prisoners had limited autonomy and could be subjected to experimental procedures with minimal resistance, while psychiatric hospitals provided another captive population. The same logic covered children's institutions. Nobody dropped out. Everyone stayed available for follow-up. Refusals were rare, and enrollment was cheap, compared with recruiting free-living children whose parents had to be found, informed, persuaded, and retained across an entire study period. Set those advantages out and the shape of the problem becomes visible. Every single one of them is an advantage to the researcher created by a disadvantage of the subject. Captivity becomes retention. Powerlessness becomes compliance. Poverty becomes low cost. Nothing on that list is a scientific reason to prefer one population over another. Every item is an administrative convenience, and each one is purchased directly out of somebody else's inability to say no. The knowledge base entry on the Fernald School, a Massachusetts state institution, describes the mechanism plainly. Researchers saw the institution's captive population as an ideal subject pool. The residents were mostly children and adolescents. They had, in the entry's words, no legal rights, and were unable to give or withhold consent. Many of the parents had been pressured into placing their children there at all, and were, in the same account, desperate and compliant. The polio vaccine trials of the 1950s included children at several state facilities, where consent came from administrators rather than parents. Be precise about the wrong here. The vaccines themselves were a genuine public health achievement, and none of this is a reason to distrust them or to avoid medical care. The wrong was procedural. Children who had no way to understand what was being done were enrolled by adults who never had to ask them. The structural problem has 3 parts, and it is identical whether the setting is a prison, a psychiatric ward, or a children's institution. First, the subject cannot leave, cannot understand, and cannot meaningfully agree or refuse. Second, the person who agrees on their behalf carries interests of their own. Third, the machinery that was supposed to catch the resulting failures either did not exist, or existed on paper and was unequal to the job. Look closely at that second part because it is where the paperwork fails. An administrator's signature could satisfy a form, could not do what consent is for. That administrator might never have met the child, might have been responsible for hundreds of others, and might reasonably have seen the study as a way to bring money or standing to an under-resourced institution. Those are not evil motives. They are simply not the child's interests. And parental consent, where it was sought, was constrained exactly as the Willowbrook parents' consent was constrained. A parent with no other placement, no money and no leverage is not negotiating freely. When the alternative to taking part is continued confinement in substandard conditions, agreement is not a free choice. It is the least bad option available to someone left with no good ones. Call that what it is, coercion by circumstance, rather than by threat. These vaccine cases are far less famous than Tuskegee or Willowbrook, and the reason is instructive. They were diffuse, scattered across many institutions and many small studies rather than concentrated into one scandal with one name. But one caution stated plainly before we go further. This record establishes precedent. It does not establish continuity. It is not evidence that hospitals, prisons, or research bodies are running covert programs today. That is a separate claim requiring separate evidence. Now follow the federal money west out of the prisons of the East Coast, and it leads to Los Angeles. In the early 1970s, the University of California, Los Angeles hosted a center for the study and reduction of violence. This was not a prison program and not a hospital program. It was a research center on a major university campus, and it became one of the most contested items in the subcommittee's entire survey. The center was underwritten by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, a Justice Department agency created by the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 to fund improvements in state and local policing. By the early 1970s, that mandate had stretched a very long way. The agency had become a significant funder of research into the causes, the prediction, and the control of violent behavior. The Senate study reproduces 2 proposed research titles from the center's own materials. The first, The Medical Epidemiology of Criminals. The second, Early Prediction of Individual Violence. Together they propose moving law enforcement from responding to crime after it happens toward forecasting it in named individuals. What the intervention would then be was never specified. Whether such a prediction can be made accurately at all is the question we turn to next. But a label has to be earned, and here the science gives way. The scientific problem with the UCLA Center's ambition was fundamental, and it remains so. Picking out the one person who will commit an assault from the thousands who share the same risk factors and never will is a problem that has resisted a validated solution for the entire 50 years since those proposals were written. No instrument has closed that gap. Start with the arithmetic because it settles the argument before any ethics enter. Serious violence is rare in the general population. That low base rate means any predictive instrument, however well designed, produces a large crop of false positives, people marked as dangerous who would never have harmed anyone. Even a screening test that is 90% accurate, an unrealistically high standard for behavioral prediction, would flag roughly 10 innocent people for everyone it caught. Work it through on 1,000 people. If 1 in 100 would genuinely commit violence, that is 10 people. A test that catches 90% of them finds 9. But the same test misreads 10% of the 990 who are harmless, 99 names. 9 correct flags, 99 wrong ones. The people wrongly labeled outnumber the people correctly identified by an order of magnitude. That ratio is a property of rare events. That is not a complaint about 1970s statistics. Half a century on, no instrument reliably identifies which specific individual will become violent. Actuarial tools used in courts and clinics today can sort groups by risk. They cannot name the person. The gap between a group probability and an individual forecast is where the whole enterprise fails, and the subcommittee's investigators grasped it clearly, without any special training in statistics. The consequences are not abstract. A person marked as previolent, provisionally, tentatively, in a research file rather than a police database, faces institutionalization, monitoring, restricted liberty, and the stigma of being publicly named a threat. This series draws a line from that logic to present-day targeting claims, and that line is our argument, not the subcommittee's finding. What the record establishes is precedent. Continuity would need separate evidence. Say the difference out loud every time. The Senate subcommittee's worry was never mere skepticism about whether the science worked. It was that a federally funded program, aimed explicitly at flagging dangerous people before any offense, created an obvious hazard. Individuals labeled a threat on the strength of unproven predictive methods, carrying every consequence such a label brings, attached to a scientific claim that had not been independently validated, and arguably could not yet be validated at all. 5 words, and every problem sits inside them. Early, before anything has happened. Prediction, a forecast, not a finding. Individual, not a population trend but a named person. Violence, the most consequential label a state can attach. The Center wrote that title itself. The Senate study simply reproduced it from the Center's own materials. Nobody had to characterize the ambition. It characterized itself. Read it slowly and the whole controversy follows. By the time the subcommittee compiled its report, the UCLA Center had become a public controversy in its own right. The objection was not confined to Washington. Civil liberties organizations questioned the implications of pre-crime labeling. Faculty at UCLA itself objected to their university hosting research with such obvious potential for abuse. Community groups in Los Angeles saw immediately who any prediction system would be pointed at. 3 constituencies, arriving at the same conclusion by different routes. The faculty objection is worth dwelling on, because it came from inside the institution that stood to receive the money. These were colleagues of the researchers on the same campus reading the same proposals, and they concluded that their university should not be in this business. Internal dissent of that kind is unusual, and it is documented. It cost the Center the presumption of academic legitimacy that federal grants normally confer. The coalition was broad, and its members did not agree about much else. Civil liberties lawyers argued the constitutional case. Faculty argued the scientific one. Community organizations argued from experience of policing. Students protested. Mental health advocates worried about who would be committed on the strength of a forecast. Reporters carried it to a wider public. Legislators, already reading the subcommittee's draft, found their concerns confirmed outside the hearing room. The Center had no constituency of its own. Community groups recognized, correctly, that any violence prediction system would fall hardest on the same poor, Black and brown neighborhoods that were already heavily policed. The reason is mechanical rather than malicious. A predictive model learns from arrest and conviction records, and those records reflect where officers were sent, not where harm occurred. Feed policing patterns into a forecast, and the forecast returns the policing patterns, now wearing the authority of science. The Center became one of the most visible symbols of a broader national debate. Whether the tools of behavior modification, prediction, labeling, intervention, belonged in the hands of law enforcement at all. That debate was not settled in a seminar. It was fought in newspapers, in council chambers, in campus meetings, and in the correspondence files of a Senate subcommittee, and it fed directly into the funding reckoning this chapter reaches shortly. Now return to the sentence this chapter opened with, and notice what it names. The subcommittee identified 2 captive populations, not 1. Everything so far has concerned prisoners, people confined through the criminal courts with a conviction, a sentence, and eventually a release date. The second population is different, and in one respect harder to bound. Patients held under civil commitment, confined not by a fixed term but by an ongoing clinical judgment. That distinction matters enormously for consent. A prisoner's release date, however distant, is a known quantity, a parole eligibility date, a sentence expiry, a number on a calendar. A committed patient's discharge depends on an evolving diagnosis, written and rewritten by the very institution asking them to take part in research. One person is counting down. The other is waiting on a judgment that has no fixed end. That asymmetry is the whole of it. Here is the mechanism. Cooperation with a research program can be read, consciously or not, as evidence of improving insight, engagement with treatment, readiness for a less restrictive setting. Declining can be read as continued illness, poor judgment, a refusal to engage with care the institution has decided is needed. Nothing improper need be intended by anyone. The incentive structure does the work on its own, quietly. That is what makes it structural rather than personal. The knowledge base entry on the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights puts the scope plainly, and note the 2 nouns held together in one clause: informed consent and involuntary treatment. Those are the 2 hinges of this chapter. The subcommittee treated patients as equally central to its inquiry, not a footnote to the prison chapters. A choice reflecting how structurally similar the 2 captivities are, despite their very different legal foundations. A psychiatrist judging readiness for discharge is meant to be assessing a mental state, symptoms, stability of mood, capacity for self-care. In a setting where taking part in a behavior program is one of the few visible markers of engagement, the difference between this patient's depression has lifted and this patient is cooperative can collapse. None of that is an argument against seeking psychiatric care. It is an argument about custody. Congress was not working alone on this question. The courts were arriving at compatible conclusions almost simultaneously. In July 1973, the same year Project START's program description was revised twice. A Michigan Circuit Court decided Kamowitz versus Department of Mental Health. Chapter 22 examines that case in detail. What matters here is the timing, because 2 branches of government reached the same conclusion within roughly 18 months. Neither was waiting on the other. The Michigan court held that a person confined involuntarily in an institution could not give legally adequate consent to an experimental, irreversible psychosurgical procedure, because the conditions of confinement made truly voluntary agreement impossible to establish. Read that carefully. The court did not find the surgeon dishonest or the patient incapable. It found the setting disqualifying. Consent, it said, cannot be manufactured inside a building the person is not free to leave. A judge in Michigan, working from one man's case, and a subcommittee in Washington, working from a federal paper trail across dozens of programs, arrived independently at the same structural insight. Captivity compromises consent. Chapter 26 traces the wider legal framework that followed through Wyatt, Connect, and the rest. What remains for this chapter is the money, and the precise date in February 1974 when it stopped. That date is worth a section of its own. The courts and the Congress had arrived at the same conclusion. What happened next is rarer, and it deserves a date. On the 14th of February, 1974, less than 2 years after Project START's first program description was written, and in the same month the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights was compiling its final report, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration announced that it was canceling its funding for behavior-related projects and medical research. The category of grant being canceled was precisely the one that had underwritten the UCLA Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence, its proposals to study the medical epidemiology of criminals, and to achieve early prediction of individual violence. The Senate study records the cancellation as a direct, traceable outcome of the subcommittee's own investigation. Oversight, for once, translated into a change in where federal dollars actually went, rather than a report filed and forgotten. Hold that phrase in mind because it is the reason the money mattered. A program promising the early prediction of individual violence needed subjects who could not walk away, and it needed federal grants to pay for them. Cutting the grant category did not refute the science. It removed the budget line. Sometimes that is what oversight looks like. Not an argument one, but a payment that stops being made. It is worth naming how unusual that clarity is. Much of the material in this series concerns claims that are contested, ambiguous, deniable, or impossible to verify from outside the institutions involved. This is the opposite. A specific federal agency on a specific date took a specific documented action in specific response to specific congressional scrutiny. Every element of that sentence can still be checked against the government's own paperwork, half a century later. The chain runs in one direction. The subcommittee holds hearings and gathers a federal paper trail. It identifies behavior modification programs running on captive populations, compiles its findings. Within the same month, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration ends the grant category that had paid for them. The Senate study states the connection itself. That is oversight functioning, belatedly, imperfectly, but functioning. This is the system correcting itself once on paper. 5 months separate the two dates. On the 14th of February, 1974, the money stopped. On the 12th of July the same year, Congress passed the National Research Act, Public Law 93-348. The funding cut did not stand alone. It landed in the middle of the single most consequential year in the history of American research ethics, a year that rewrote how human experiments must be approved. The National Research Act created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. It also established, for the first time in American law, a federal requirement that research on human subjects funded by the Department of Health, Education and Welfare be reviewed and approved by an independent committee before it could begin. Later, through the common rule, that requirement extended across most other federal agencies. That committee has a name every researcher now knows: the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. Its job is to read a protocol before the work starts, weigh risk against benefit, check that consent is genuinely informed, and pay particular attention to subjects whose circumstances limit their freedom to refuse. Prisoners were later given their own separate protective subpart in the federal regulations, precisely because of the history this chapter has been describing. Over the 5 years that followed, the Commission produced the Belmont Report of 1979. It set out 3 principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, that still define the ethical baseline for every IRB in the United States. Justice, in Belmont's sense, asks a blunt question: who bears the burden of research and who receives the benefit? For the captive populations in this chapter, the historical answer had been all burden and no benefit. Set the dates side by side and the shape of the hinge appears. 1972, project starts, first program description. 1973, Kamowitz decided in Michigan. February 1974, the funding canceled. July, the National Research Act. 1979, Belmont. 7 years from a prison behavior program to a national ethical framework, which is fast for law and very slow for the people who were already inside. Both halves are worth saying. No single scandal had been enough. Holmesburg, with its decades of unregulated pharmaceutical testing on incarcerated men. Willowbrook, with its deliberate infection of institutionalized children. Tuskegee, with its 40-year withholding of treatment from black men with syphilis. And MKUltra dosing unwitting subjects with psychoactive drugs. Individually, each was absorbed. Surfacing together inside roughly 5 years, They created the political conditions that made legislation unavoidable. The subcommittee's investigation both reflected that moment and accelerated it. The knowledge base entry on the Kennedy Subcommittee hearings on biomedical research describes the same convergence from another angle, hearings that exposed widespread abuses in federally funded research on prisoners, institutionalized children, psychiatric patients, and racial minorities, and that led directly to the National Research Act. Two subcommittees, working different files, reached one conclusion. The existing rules had never been written for people who could not leave. That is the sentence the whole reform turns on. Now the harder half of the story. These were real achievements and they deserve to be called that. But an IRB is a committee. It can catch abuse if it is diligent, well-informed, and properly resourced. Cannot catch what it is never told about. The system depends on the conscientiousness of the people who sit on it, and on the honesty of the researchers who describe their work to it. Be precise about the limits. The cancellation applied to one category of funding from one federal agency. It did not end behavior modification research in prisons, mental hospitals, or university laboratories. It redirected the federal money most visibly attached to controversial behavioral programs, while other funding streams continued. A grant category closing is not a practice ending, and the Senate study never claimed otherwise. The distinction matters more than the headline. Set the two columns against each other. On one side, a named commission, a legal requirement for prior review, 3 codified principles, and a separate protective rule for prisoners. On the other, no change to the fact of confinement, no cure for the asymmetry of power inside it, no reach into research that is never disclosed, and no remedy for the people already harmed. Both columns are true simultaneously. Holding both is the honest position. And underneath all of it sits the problem the subcommittee actually identified. A prison, by its nature, controls the people inside it. A psychiatric hospital, by its nature, restricts the liberty of its patients. No committee can convert those settings into sites of genuinely free choice, because the settings themselves are built to prevent exactly that. The asymmetry is not a flaw in the institution. It is the institution. That is a structural fact, not an accusation. The knowledge base entry on the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights puts the finding plainly. The word captive was chosen deliberately. It was meant to force a confrontation with the inadequacy of ordinary consent rules for people who cannot leave the building. That is piece A of the file, and everything else in this chapter rests on it. Two populations, named by Congress, sharing one structural inability to decline without cost. Piece B is the programs themselves. Project START at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, revised twice in 13 months under evident pressure, connected to a purpose-built research facility at Butner, North Carolina. The UCLA Center, with its ambition to predict violence in named individuals before any offense. In the surrounding context, Holmesbug's decades of pharmaceutical testing on incarcerated men paid a few dollars, and MKUltra's classified behavior control research, which reached some institutionalized populations without their knowledge. Piece C is the context. Tuskegee and Willowbrook, fully documented, publicly exposed, and in the living memory of the Congress being asked to act. Piece D is the dated reckoning. February 14th, the funding, July 12th, the act, 1979, Belmont. None of these pieces requires speculation. Each rests on the government's own reproduced paperwork, or on the journalism and scholarship that later filled in the detail. That is what makes the file usable. What the file adds up to is a documented case study in how unaccountable research on confined populations gets built, gets investigated, and, in this one instance partially, gets defunded and reformed. It does not establish that anything comparable runs today. That would be a separate claim needing separate evidence. What it establishes is precedent. Next, we ask what precedent is actually worth to someone navigating institutions now. That question is where this chapter turns. So the file sits assembled, and the reckoning has a date on it. The harder question is what any of that changes for someone trying to understand the present. This history offers something rarer than sympathy, and more useful. It offers precedent, a government admitting on its own paper what it funded and whom it failed to protect. Before we ask what that precedent proves, we must be exact about what it does not. Here is the admission stated plainly. The federal government funded behavior modification research on people who could not meaningfully refuse, and it conceded that its own review structures were inadequate to protect them at the time. That is not an accusation from outside the building. It is the finding of a Senate subcommittee, printed and bound and shelved, and it can still be pulled from an archive and read by anyone who asks for it. This book keeps three categories apart, and this is the moment to say why. There is what the record documents. There is what the record leaves contested. And there is what a reader infers from the one to the other. The first two belong to history. The third belongs to argument, ours and not the archives. Every time we cross that line in this series, we say so out loud, including right now. So let us cross that line carefully. This history does not prove any specific claim about present-day targeting, and this book never suggests that it does. What it proves is narrower and much sturdier. It proves that the instinct many targets carry, that consent inside a coercive system is not the same thing as consent inside a free one, is not a fringe belief at all. Precedent is not continuity. Say both halves, always. Now consider the vocabulary itself. Behavior modification, captive populations, coerced participation, consent obtained under duress, involuntary treatment. Those are not phrases invented on a support forum somewhere on the internet. They were defined, documented, and cataloged by the United States Congress half a century ago, precisely because the Congress had concluded that the underlying reality was real. When a target reaches for those words, that target is quoting a Senate committee. The knowledge base entry on the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights sums up the scope in a single sentence. And the word sitting inside those quotation marks is the subcommittee's own. Captive. Not vulnerable, not disadvantaged, not underserved. Captive, a word chosen deliberately to force a confrontation with a plain fact. A person who cannot leave the building cannot freely decline what the building is proposing to do to them. The term was chosen to unsettle. And two very different rooms reached that conclusion within a year of each other, without coordinating. A Michigan court, ruling in 1973 on whether a man held by the state could consent to experimental brain surgery, decided that he could not. A Senate subcommittee, reporting in 1974, decided that confinement corrodes consent as a general matter. A court and a committee working separately, arriving at the very same place. Which points straight at the practical lesson, and it is a lesson about method. This history is usable precisely because it is dated, sourced, and undisputed. A program name, a revision date, a funding cancellation, public law number. Build the case about the present the very same way. Cite what can be dated and sourced, keep it clearly separated from what remains contested, and let the paperwork carry the weight instead of your certainty. The 1974 reckoning is persuasive exactly because nobody has to take anyone's word for it. The paperwork speaks for itself. But a reckoning is not a conclusion, and the subcommittee's investigation, the funding cut, and the National Research Act were not the end of this story. They were a hinge. What happened on the far side of that hinge is a harder and considerably less tidy account, and it is still unfolding around us today. The review system created in 1974 has been, ever since, two things at the same time. It is a genuine protection, and thousands of studies have been revised or refused because a committee asked the right question. It is also a standing frustration, criticized by researchers as slow and bureaucratic, and by patient advocates as too deferential to the institutions that pay for it. Both criticisms can be true together. But there is a limit built into the very design. An institutional review board is a committee. It reads what researchers write down, and it approves or refuses on that basis. Can stop a badly designed study. It cannot catch a study it is never told about, and it cannot dissolve a power imbalance built into the walls of the institution it reviews. That was true in 1974. It remains true. And the populations the subcommittee named have not disappeared. American prisons hold more than 1 million people today. Conditions vary enormously, and nothing in this chapter claims that experiments are running inside them. The point is structural, and it is a narrow one. For a person whose sentence, housing, and release date all sit in the hands of the institution asking the question, refusal is no easier now than it was then. American psychiatric institutions are far smaller and far less crowded than their mid-century counterparts, and that change was real and hard-won. Yet civil commitment persists, and under it a person's liberty can depend on appearing cooperative. Nothing here is an argument against seeking treatment. If you need care, get care. This is an argument about a setting in which agreement and compliance become difficult to tell apart, even when everyone is acting in good faith. And new populations have appeared that the subcommittee could not possibly have imagined. People under electronic monitoring. People whose data is collected, scored, and acted upon without their knowledge. Whether any of that counts as research on human subjects is genuinely contested, and this chapter does not pretend to settle it. But the question the subcommittee asked about confinement, what consent means when refusal is not really available, travels intact into that territory. The subcommittee's central question was never actually answered. It asked whether the federal government has any business participating in programs that may alter the substance of individual freedom. That question was not resolved in 1974. It was deferred, partly addressed by a statute, partly by a committee structure, and otherwise left open for somebody else to pick up later. Half a century on, it is still sitting there, waiting. So set the two columns beside each other honestly. On the one side, what 1974 genuinely changed. A funding stream cut, a federal statute passed, independent review required, ethical principles finally written down. On the other, what it left exactly where it stood. The prison, the commitment order, the asymmetry between an institution and the people it holds. Reform moved the paperwork. It did not and could not move the walls. The knowledge base preserves a blunt summary of who ended up inside these programs, drawn from the Mind Justice Evidence Survey and describing the 1950s through the 1970s. It is worth hearing because it names the selection principle exactly. Not the dangerous, not the clinically interesting, the available, the people least able to complain, least likely to be believed, and least able to hire anyone to argue on their behalf. Lay the dates in a row because the sequence is itself the argument. 1972. A wire service reporter exposes 40 years of untreated syphilis. 1973. A Michigan court rules that confinement and consent do not mix. February, 1974. The funding stops. July, the statute passes. 1979. The principles are finally written down. 5 years, 5 documents, and every one of them checkable by date. No trust in the teller is required. This chapter does not stand on its own, and it was never meant to. It rests on the part before it which laid out the techniques themselves, the token economy, the aversive conditioning equipment sold from an ordinary commercial catalog, the neurosurgical arguments of the book Violence and the Brain, and the Kamowitz and Wyatt rulings that tested all of it in court. Without that groundwork, this would be names without a mechanism. From here the road runs forward. The weaponization of psychiatry, the Department of Defense and the national security machinery. Then the legal framework, the institutional culture, and the contemporary legacy of everything traced here. Each carries the same discipline. Separate the documented from the inferred. Cite what can be cited. Let the record speak. But before we travel, the closing stretch of this episode sets the whole file down and says plainly what it proves. Cross-references done, the file is still open on the table. Before we close this chapter, let us walk back through it once, slowly, and separate what the paperwork proves from what it suggests. The record here is unusually solid. Program names, revision dates, statute numbers, a funding cancellation with a day attached. That solidity is the point. It is also the standard this series holds itself to, and the standard we ask of every claim about the present. Start where the chapter's longest-running case begins. Holmesburg Prison, a stone fortress in northeast Philadelphia, opened in 1896, and by the 1950s was notoriously overcrowded. In 1951, a University of Pennsylvania dermatologist, Albert Kligman, was asked to investigate an outbreak of athlete's foot there. He saw something else as well. Men who could not leave, could not miss a follow-up visit, and could be observed for as long as a study required. Over roughly 2 decades, the historian Alan Hornblum documented several thousand experiments on hundreds of Holmesburg men. Some were trivial. Many were not. Payment was a few dollars, which mattered enormously to men with no other income at all. And that is the whole problem in miniature. If the alternative to volunteering is having nothing for stamps or toothpaste, then the word voluntary has already been bent badly out of shape. Lay the dates out and the shape appears. 1947, the Nuremberg Code. 1951, Holmesburg. 1961, Irving Goffman naming the total institution. 1972, the Tuskegee exposure. 1973, a Michigan court in Kamowitz. 1974, the Senate study and the National Research Act. A principle stated, then largely ignored for a quarter of a century, then rediscovered under pressure by a court and a subcommittee working entirely separately. Which brings us back to the word the Senate itself put inside quotation marks. Captive. Staff investigators for the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights could have written confined, or institutionalized, or incarcerated. They chose the hardest available word, and they chose it for 2 groups: prisoners held by criminal sentence and patients held under civil commitment. The argument was carried in the vocabulary. Neither group, in the subcommittee's phrase, can simply walk out. The structure underneath is simple enough to draw. The state takes custody. Custody makes a person dependent on the same staff who decide privileges, parole, or discharge. Refusal is therefore never free of consequence, whether or not anybody ever voices a threat. A signature collected under that arrangement records agreement without recording choice. The form is real. The voluntariness that Nuremberg demanded may simply be absent, and no paperwork can show the difference. Irving Goffman gave the setting its name in 1961. A total institution controls nearly every dimension of daily life under a single roof. Waking time, diet, contact with the outside world. The Senate never cited him, yet its instinct to examine prisons and psychiatric wards side by side tracks exactly the same insight. Where research participation tangles with housing assignments, ward privileges, and a chart the subject may never read, consent has competition. Inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons, that logic had a name: Project START, Special Treatment and Rehabilitative Training, whose program description was written in October 1972, then rewritten twice inside 13 months. The Senate preserved all 3 versions rather than only the last. Behind it stood Butner, North Carolina, a facility named in the Bureau's own materials and planned with research in its founding purpose. Not an improvised experiment. An institutional commitment with an address. 1972 is the year the ground moved. In July, the Associated Press reporter Gene Heller published what a Public Health Service investigator, Peter Buxton, had spent years trying to raise through internal channels and getting nowhere. Within weeks, the country had a scandal it could not argue away. The subcommittee's catalog of behavior modification programs would land, 2 years later, in a nation that had already lost its innocence about medical research. 2 cases did that work. In Alabama, from 1932, 600 black men were enrolled in a public health service study of untreated syphilis, told they were being treated for bad blood, and left without penicillin for 25 years after the cure existed. At Willowbrook, on Staten Island, children in an overcrowded institution were deliberately exposed to hepatitis, with parental consent obtained on terms that ethicists later described as coercive. Then the classified layer. MKUltra ran from 1953 on CIA money channeled through front foundations, so that many researchers never knew whose funds they were taking. Most of its subjects were not prisoners, and the programs should not be blurred together. But one sub-project reached incarcerated men at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Most files were destroyed in 1973, on the order of the agency's then-director, Richard Helms. The reckoning, when it came, arrived with dates attached. 2 of them closed the story. February 14, 1974, when the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration canceled its funding for behavior-related and medical research, the very category that had underwritten the UCLA Violence Center. And July 12, 1974, when the National Research Act became law, creating the commission whose Belmont Report in 1979 still defines every ethics review conducted in America today. Now the line this series will not cross. Everything just recapped is documented, dated, and largely undisputed. What follows from it is an argument, and it belongs in a separate column. This history shows that captivity corrodes consent, and that federal oversight failed to notice for years. It does not show that prisons, hospitals, or research programs are running covert operations today. That is a separate claim, and it needs separate evidence. Be equally honest about the reform. The funding cut touched one category of grant at one agency. The National Research Act built an oversight structure that depends on diligent members, adequate resourcing, and researchers describing their work truthfully. An institutional review board can stop what it is told about, cannot stop what it never hears. The asymmetry between an institution and the people it holds survived the reckoning entirely intact. And here is where the evidence runs out. We have no line-by-line comparison of what each START revision altered. The Senate reproduced the documents without annotating them. We cannot know MKUltra's full scope, because the records are gone. Nobody can give a reliable count of people enrolled without meaningful consent. The record thins exactly where it would matter most. And nothing in this history is a reason to avoid a doctor or a therapist today. One sentence carries this entire chapter. American judges wrote it in 1947, at the trial of Nazi physicians, and the Senate reprinted it a quarter of a century later as an appendix to its own study. Everything since elaborates on it: Helsinki, Belmont, the common rule. Read that line inside a cell block or a locked ward, and the difficulty is immediate. Voluntary consent requires a real option to refuse without penalty. Everything in this episode is traceable, and here is the trail. The spine is the Senate Subcommittee's own study of 1974, held as Entry 2 in the One Voice knowledge base, with its preface and its second and third appendices. Around it sit the statute, the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, the Kamowitz ruling, the Church Committee, and the published histories by Hornblum, Goffman, and Mitford. Check any of them. That is the point. If this history proves anything useful, it is that documentation is what eventually moved a government. So a warm invitation. TI One Voice is a place to read the record and to add to it, carefully, at one.witisk.org. Our live stream, TITV, runs at meet.witisk.org, under Public, TITV. Write down what is dateable. Keep it separate from what you suspect. That discipline is your strongest instrument. Next time, Part 24, The Weaponization of Psychiatry, From the Seed to Psychosurgery. This chapter asked what confinement does to consent. The next asks a harder question. What happens when the diagnosis itself becomes the instrument, when treatment and control stop being distinguishable? We follow a Florida youth program called The Seed, and the Veterans Administration's own circulars on psychosurgery, and we return to the Nuremberg Code to ask how it was applied. Thank you for staying with a difficult 2 hours. The people in this record were not case numbers. They were men in a Philadelphia jail, children on Staten Island, farmers in Alabama, patients on locked wards, and they were owed a choice that nobody gave them. We cannot return it. We can refuse to let the file close quietly. Take care of yourself, keep your own record honestly, and we will see you next time.